The medieval world was a place where faith held sway, where the Pope was the ultimate spiritual authority, and where a single papal decree could shake kingdoms to their foundations. What happened when Queen's powerful, influential women dared to defy that authority, when they faced the Church's most terrifying punishment? Excommunication? When the very gates of heaven were slammed shut in their faces, at least in the eyes of the Church, did they crumble or did they fight back? Number 1. Maria of Aragon, Queen of Castile. Maria of Aragon was born in 1403. A princess from the powerful house of Trastamara, destined for a life of political alliances and high stakes. Her future was sealed when she married her cousin, King John II of Castile in 1420, making her queen consort. At a time when Europe was deeply divided by the Western Schism, a period from 1378 to 1417 when there were multiple claimants to the papacy, her life became tangled in a web of conflicting loyalties and divine pronouncements. The schism saw one pope in Rome, another in Avignon, and at one point a third in Pisa, all claiming to be the true successor of St. Peter. For ordinary people, and especially for royalty, whose legitimacy often rested on the Church's blessing, it was a time of immense confusion. Maria and John II found themselves caught in the spiritual tempest. The Kingdom of Castile had initially supported the Avignon papacy, specifically Pope Benedict XIII. However, as the schism dragged on with its endless condemnations, many European rulers grew weary of the division and sought unity. In 1417, the Council of Constance finally resolved the schism by deposing all three rival popes and electing Pope Martin V as the sole legitimate pontiff. This was a monumental moment for the Church, but it did not immediately solve all the lingering loyalty issues. Benedict XIII, the Avignon claimant, refused to accept his deposition. He retreated to Pontecorla, a fortified castle in Spain, and continued to insist he was the true pope, becoming a spiritual renegade in the eyes of the wider Church. King John II of Castile, under the influence of his powerful regent and advisors, decided to abandon Benedict XIII and formally recognize Pope Martin V, aligning Castile with the unified Church. This was a politically shrewd move, necessary for Castile to regain its standing among other European kingdoms. However, Queen Maria, deeply religious and perhaps swayed by strong personal convictions or family ties to the Avignon cause, did not agree. She continued to support Benedict XIII, even after most of Europe had abandoned him. Her unwavering loyalty to a discredited pope was a direct challenge to the authority of the newly unified Roman Church under Martin V, and more immediately to the political decision of her husband. Her actions were not merely a private matter of conscience, they were a public defiance of papal authority. Benedict XIII, despite being officially deposed, still wielded some spiritual power among his dwindling followers, and he was not afraid to use it. In a desperate attempt to maintain his influence and punish those who abandoned him, Benedict XIII issued a bull of excommunication, and Queen Maria. This decree branded them as heretics and rebels against the true Church, denying them access to sacraments, Christian burial, and social interaction with other believers. For Maria, who clung to Benedict XIII as the legitimate pope, this excommunication would have been seen as a badge of honor, a testament to her loyalty. However, for the vast majority of Catholics in Castile and across Europe, it was a dire condemnation from a figure they considered an antipope. What happened next for Maria of Aragon was a strange dichotomy. On one hand, her kingdom under John II had firmly aligned with Martin V. The excommunication issued by Benedict XIII had little practical effect within Castile, as his authority was no longer recognized there. Maria continued her life as queen, though her personal spiritual stance likely caused tension within the court. And with her husband, she continued to practice her faith in defiance of the mainstream church, maintaining her belief in Benedict XIII until his death in 1423. After his death, his few remaining supporters elected another anti-pope, Clement VIII, continuing the schism on a smaller scale. But Maria did not appear to extend her loyalty to this new figure. Maria lived for over 2 decades after Benedict XIII's excommunication of her. Her story is a testament to the complex spiritual and political landscape, where identifying the true pope was a matter of intense debate, and where personal conviction could lead to being declared an outcast by one's spiritual authority, even while remaining queen in the eyes of the world. She continued to act as Queen of Castile, bearing children, including the future King Henry IV of Castile, and later served as regent for her son. Her excommunication, coming from a man whom the vast majority of the Church considered an anti-pope, ultimately did not significantly alter her royal status or her powerful political role. She died in 1445, having navigated a treacherous spiritual and political environment, leaving behind a legacy of unwavering, if controversial, faith. Number 2. Blanch of Navarre, Queen of Castile. Blanch of Navarre, born in 1424, was a princess from the powerful house of Evreux, and destined for a life embroiled in the high politics of medieval Spain. Her story is one of a pawn in a royal chess game whose fate was dictated by powerful men and papal decrees. She was married to Henry, Prince of Asturias, the heir to the throne of Castile in 1440. This marriage was meant to solidify alliances between the kingdoms of Navarre and Castile. However, from the very beginning the marriage was plagued by problems. Prince Henry was rumored to be impotent, or perhaps uninterested in his wife, and the marriage remained unconsummated for years. In a medieval world where royal succession was everything, the inability to produce an heir was a catastrophic flaw that could unravel kingdoms. The lack of an heir from the marriage between Blanche and Henry became a major political crisis. King John II of Castile, Henry's father, and the powerful noble factions at court were desperate for an undisputed succession. After over a decade of childless marriage, the pressure mounted to find a solution. The solution proposed was an annulment which would require the approval of the Church. The grounds for annulment were based on Henry's alleged impotence, making the marriage invalid in the eyes of canon law. However, the path to annulment was never straightforward, especially when it involved royal family. Henry's mother, Maria of Aragon, who was Blanche's aunt, was strongly opposed to the annulment, perhaps seeing it as an insult to her family or a threat to her influence. Furthermore, Blanche herself, though likely deeply unhappy in her marriage, may have been reluctant to agree to an annulment that would brand her as barren or divorce her from a powerful future throne. Nevertheless, the political machinery of Castile moved forward. In 1453, a formal papal bull was issued by Pope Nicholas V, granting the annulment of the marriage between Henry and Blanche on the grounds of non-consummation due to Henry's impotence. Blanche was sent back to Navarre, effectively discarded by her husband and his family, but her troubles were far from over. Back in Navarre, her own family became another source of contention and conflict. Blanche's father, King John II of Aragon and Navarre, was a complex and ambitious man. He was constantly at odds with his elder son Charles, Prince of Viana, Blanche's brother. Charles was the rightful heir to Navarre, according to his mother's will, but John II of Aragon wanted to keep Navarre for himself and pass it to his younger daughter Leonor and her husband. This dynastic struggle plunged Navarre into a brutal civil war. Blanche, as Charles's sister, found herself caught between her father and her brother. When Charles died in 1461, under suspicious circumstances, many believed he was poisoned by his father. Blanche then became the legitimate heir to the throne of Navarre, according to traditional succession laws. This made her a direct threat to her father's ambitions and to the ambitions of her younger sister Eleanor. John II of Aragon, desperate to prevent Blanche from asserting her claim and potentially allying with his enemies, effectively imprisoned her. He tried to force her to renounce her rights to Navarre in favor of Eleanor. Blanche resisted, steadfastly asserting her birthright. Her defiance, combined with her earlier annulment and the complex web of political alliances, brought her into direct conflict with papal authority. Again, Pope Eugene IV, who succeeded Nicholas V, had been instrumental in the annulment of Blanche's marriage. When Blanche continued to resist her father's demands and assert her claim to Navarre, her father John II of Aragon sought further church intervention to strengthen his hand. The true reason for Blanche's later excommunication is debated, but it seems to have stemmed from her refusal to obey papal directives related to her inheritance. Likely orchestrated by her father, John II of Aragon, wanting to consolidate his power, obtained a papal bull from Pope Pius II, who succeeded Eugene IV, in 1462, that effectively stripped Blanche of her rights to Navarre and placed her under excommunication if she continued to press her claim. This was a classic instance of a secular ruler using papal power to achieve political ends. What happened next for Blanche was tragic. The excommunication, whether from Pius II or a later one, was a weapon used by her father to isolate her and discredit her claim. She was imprisoned in various castles, including the formidable Olite. Her defiance only strengthened her father's resolve. In 1464, Blanche was transferred to the custody of her sister Leonor, who was allied with their father. Soon after, in October 1464, Blanche died under mysterious circumstances, widely suspected to have been poisoned on the orders of her sister and father. Blanch of Navarre's life is a stark reminder that even queens could be utterly powerless, their spiritual status used as a political tool, and their lives sacrificed for dynastic ambitions. Her excommunication was less about personal sin and more about an ecclesiastical decree leveraged by a powerful father to disinherit a troublesome daughter, ultimately leading to her tragic end. Number 3. Leonor Teles de Menezes, Queen of Portugal. Leonor Teles de Menezes, born around 1350, rose from the Portuguese nobility to become queen, but her life was marked by scandal, ruthless political maneuvering, and ultimately excommunication. She was first married to a nobleman, Don João Lourenço de Cunha, and had a daughter. However, her life took a dramatic turn when she captured the attention of King Ferdinand I of Portugal. Ferdinand was already betrothed to a Castilian princess, and a marriage to her would have brought peace between the two kingdoms. But Ferdinand, impulsive and deeply infatuated with Leonor, broke off his engagement. In 1371, Ferdinand secretly married Leonor. This was a shocking move. Not only did it break a crucial political engagement, but Leonor was still technically married to her first husband, although their marriage was quickly annulled by local ecclesiastical courts under royal pressure. This scandalous, bigamous marriage, or at least one that was highly irregular and pushed through with questionable ecclesiastical authority, immediately drew the ire of both the Portuguese nobility and the Pope. The populace rioted in Lisbon, furious at the king's choice and the insult to the Castilian princess. Ferdinand was forced to present Leonor publicly as his queen and quell the unrest. Leonor, now Queen of Portugal, quickly proved herself to be a formidable and ambitious. She used her position to enrich her family, place her favorites in power, and dominate her husband, who was often weak and ill. Her political influence was immense, and her favoritism towards her family, particularly her numerous siblings, created widespread resentment among the established Portuguese nobility. She became notorious for her perceived arrogance and manipulation. The greatest challenge to her legitimacy and the peace of Portugal came from her only child with Ferdinand, Princess Beatrice. To secure Beatrice's future and protect Portugal from Castilian invasion, Ferdinand arranged a marriage between Beatrice and King John, the First of Castile. This alliance, designed to prevent war, ironically, led to Portugal's greatest crisis and Leonor's downfall. The treaty stipulated that upon Ferdinand's death, Leonor would serve as regent for Beatrice and John I, effectively making Portugal a Castilian dependency. This was unacceptable to many Portuguese who valued their independence. When King Ferdinand died in 1383, Leonor took up the regency. As stipulated, however, her actions were immediately met with resistance. Her pro-Castilian policies and her personal scandals intensified the opposition. The leader of this opposition was John of Naples, Ferdinand's illegitimate half-brother, who claimed the throne for himself, sparking a succession crisis that would become known as the Crisis of 1383 to 1385. During this period of intense political turmoil and civil war, Leonor's decisions and alliances directly clashed with the authority of the Church. The Western Schism was still ongoing. With Pope Urban VI in Rome and Antipope Clement VII in Avignon, the Portuguese court had initially recognized Urban VI. Leonor, facing overwhelming opposition and seeking to solidify her position, made a series of controversial choices that deeply offended the Roman papacy. One of the key reasons for her excommunication was her personal life and political alliances. She had taken a powerful Castilian nobleman, Count Andero, as her lover and chief advisor. This relationship was widely seen as scandalous and further alienated the Portuguese people and the Church. More significantly, in her desperation to secure the throne for her daughter Beatrice and her Castilian son-in-law, Leonor was accused of defying canonical law and undermining church peace. Pope Urban VI, the Roman Pope, recognized by Portugal, watched as Leonor's actions plunged Portugal into civil war and threatened the balance of power in Iberia. Finally, in 1384, Pope Urban VI issued a bull of excommunication against Leonor Teles de Menezes. The reasons cited were her scandalous behavior, her political actions that led to civil war, and undermined the legitimacy of the Portuguese throne, as perceived by the Church, and potentially her defiance of specific papal directives. This excommunication was a severe blow meant to delegitimize her rule and isolate her from Christian society. It painted her as a woman living in sin and a ruler rebelling against divine order. What happened next for Leonor was a swift and brutal decline. The excommunication further weakened her already precarious position. It gave moral and spiritual ammunition to her enemies, especially John of Naples, who could now claim that God was on his side. The Portuguese people, already suspicious of her and her Castilian allies, saw the excommunication as divine judgment. Leonor's rule crumbled under the weight of the rebellion. Lisbon, her stronghold, was besieged. In the face of overwhelming opposition, Leonor was forced to flee. John of Naples, with the support of the Portuguese people and key noble factions, eventually triumphed at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385, decisively defeating the Castilian forces and asserting his claim to the throne. Leonor, stripped of her power and title, fled to Castile, where she hoped to find refuge and support for her daughter's claim. However, even in Castile, her fortunes continued to worsen. She was eventually imprisoned on the orders of her own son-in-law, John I of Castile, who perhaps saw her as a liability or a threat to his own control over Beatrice. She died in exile, likely in a convent in Castile around 1386. Her excommunication was a powerful factor in her downfall, transforming a political struggle into a moral crusade against a queen seen as corrupt and defiant of God's law. Her story is a dramatic example of how a queen's personal life and political ambition could lead to spiritual condemnation and ultimate ruin. Number 4. Joanna II of Naples, Queen of Naples. Joanna II of Naples, born in 1373, inherited a kingdom perpetually plagued by internal strife, external threats, and the complexities of the Great Western Schism. She ascended to the throne of Naples in 1414, succeeding her brother Ladislaus. Joanna was a woman of mature years, twice a widow, and she faced an immense challenge. Her kingdom was a papal fief, meaning it was technically held from the Pope, giving the pontiff significant leverage over Neapolitan affairs. This dependence on papal favor would prove to be a constant source of trouble throughout her reign. Her reign began in the shadow of the Western Schism, which had plunged the Church into disarray with multiple competing popes. At the time of her accession, there was Pope Gregory XII, Antipope, Benepope, the 13th, and the Pisan Antipope, John the 23rd. Naples, being a papal fief, was particularly sensitive to who held the papal keys. Joanna initially recognized John the 23rd, but the Council of Constance in 1417 finally brought an end to the schism, electing Pope Martin V as the sole legitimate pope. This was meant to bring stability, but for Joanna it merely shifted the dynamics of her struggle with the papacy. Joanna was a formidable yet often impulsive ruler. Her personal life was as complex as her political one. She was known for her many lovers and favorites, who often wielded significant power in her court. This, combined with her political maneuvering, frequently put her at odds with Pope Martin V. Martin V was a strong pope, determined to restore papal authority after the chaos of the schism. He saw Naples as a crucial territory to control, and he expected Joanna to be an obedient vassal. One of the major points of contention arose from Joanna's succession. Despite her 2 marriages, she had no surviving legitimate children, making the succession a pressing issue. To secure her kingdom and protect it from foreign claims, Joanna adopted Alfonso V of Aragon as her heir in 1421. This was a strategic move, bringing a powerful ally to Naples. However, this adoption also complicated her relationship, who had his own interests in the Neapolitan succession. The relationship between Joanna and Alfonso quickly soured. Alfonso, ambitious and assertive, began to act as if he were already king, which chafed at Joanna's authority. She felt sidelined and threatened. In a dramatic reversal, Joanna decided to revoke Alfonso's adoption. Instead, she adopted Louis III of Anjou, a rival claimant to the Neapolitan throne, as her new heir. In 1423, this switch was a direct challenge to Alfonso V and further destabilized the political landscape of Italy. It also enraged Pope Martin V. Pope Martin V saw Joanna's actions as a direct defiance of his authority. The Anjou line, which Louis III represented, had historically been favored by some popes, but Joanna's impulsive adoption and then rejection of heirs, along with her general defiance of papal influence in Neapolitan affairs, was seen as unacceptable. Martin V believed that Naples, as a papal fief, should be guided by papal interests. He was also concerned about the political instability Joanna's actions were creating in Italy, which could undermine the nascent peace after the schism. In 1423, Pope Martin V issued a bull of excommunication against Joanna II of Naples. The grounds for this excommunication were multifaceted. They included her perceived disloyalty as a vassal of the Holy See, her defiance of papal wishes regarding the succession, her scandalous personal life, though this was often used as a general justification for attacking a ruler, and her disruptive political maneuvers that threatened the peace of Italy. The excommunication stripped Joanna of her spiritual rights, forbade Christian burial, and encouraged her subjects to rebel against her. It was the ultimate weapon in the Pope's arsenal, aimed at breaking a ruler's will and legitimacy. What happened next for Joanna was a period of intense conflict and negotiation. The excommunication was a severe blow, but Joanna was a seasoned survivor. She understood the power of the Church, but also the limits of a papal ban in a turbulent political landscape. The excommunication did not immediately depose her, but it severely weakened her position. Alfonso V, furious at being disinherited, invaded Naples, and a bitter struggle ensued. Louis III of Anjou also pressed his claim, further complicating the situation. Joanna, however, was a master of political opportunism. She managed to survive the challenges, often by playing her powerful rivals against each other. Despite the excommunication, she maintained support among certain factions of her nobility and within Naples. The Pope, seeing that the excommunication was not achieving the desired immediate effect of bringing Joanna to heel, and perhaps concerned about the wider de-Napolization, eventually sought a resolution. Through shrewd diplomacy and a series of concessions, Joanna managed to reconcile with Pope Martin V. She promised greater obedience to papal authority and reaffirmed Naples' status as a papal fief. In return, Martin V lifted the excommunication. This reconciliation was a testament to Joanna's resilience and political skill. She was able to survive the Church's ultimate condemnation and retain her throne. Joanna II continued to rule Naples until her death in 1435. Her reign remained turbulent, marked by internal feuds and constant threats from various claimants. Despite the excommunication and the endless power struggles, she maintained her grip on the throne. Her story demonstrates how a determined monarch, even when facing the severest spiritual punishment, could negotiate and survive if they possessed sufficient political acumen and support. She was a queen who stared down the Pope's wrath and lived to tell the tale, leaving behind a legacy of a tenacious, if controversial, ruler. Number 5. Joanna I of Naples, Queen of Naples. Joanna I of Naples, born in 1326, was a vibrant and complex figure whose life was a whirlwind of political intrigue, personal tragedy, and a shocking excommunication. She inherited the Kingdom of Naples and Provence in 1343 at the tender age of 16. Naples, as mentioned before, was a papal fief, meaning its rulers owed fealty to the Pope, a fact that would constantly shape Joanna's destiny. Her first major crisis revolved around the murder of her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, in 1345. Andrew was unpopular with the Neapolitan nobility, and even with Joanna herself, who found him crude and domineering. His death, which occurred in her presence, immediately implicated Joanna. Though she was later cleared by a papal inquiry, the suspicion of her involvement, or at least her complicity, clung to her, fueling animosity from Andrew's powerful Hungarian family, led by his brother King Louis I of Hungary. Louis invaded Naples, seeking vengeance, plunging the kingdom into chaos. Joanna spent much of her early reign navigating wars, invasions, and intricate political alliances, often forced to flee her kingdom. She married 3 more times, always seeking alliances and heirs to secure her volatile throne. Despite the turmoil, she developed a reputation as an intelligent, cultured, and formidable ruler. She was a patron of the arts and fiercely defended her royal prerogatives against both internal factions and external threats. Her ultimate downfall, and the reason for her excommunication, was inextricably linked to the Great Western Schism. In 1378, after the death of Pope Gregory XI, a tumultuous papal election led to the election of 2 popes, Urban VI in Rome and Clement VII in Avignon. Europe was divided, and rulers were forced to choose sides. Joanna I initially recognized Urban VI, as was traditional for Naples, a papal fief. In Italy, Urban VI, however, quickly proved to be a volatile, aggressive, and highly unpopular pontiff. He alienated many cardinals and rulers with his harsh policies and erratic behavior. Joanna, who was also facing threats from her cousin Charles of Durazzo, a claimant to the Neapolitan throne, backed by Hungarian interests, found herself increasingly at odds with Urban VI. Urban, convinced that Joanna was plotting against him, or not sufficiently loyal, began to undermine her authority, and even threatened her with deposition. In a desperate move to secure her throne and counter Urban's growing hostility, Joanna made a fateful decision. She switched her allegiance from Urban VI to Clement VII, the Avignon antipope. This was a calculated yet incredibly dangerous political gamble. By recognizing Clement VII, Joanna was directly defying the Pope, recognized by a significant portion of Europe, and, crucially, the Pope who held direct feudal authority over Naples. Urban VI was furious. He declared Joanna a schismatic and a heretic for abandoning him and supporting his rival. In 1380, Pope Urban VI issued a bull of excommunication against Joanna I of Naples. This decree was devastating. It stripped her of her spiritual rights, declared her an illegitimate ruler, and released her subjects from their oaths of loyalty. Urban VI went even further. He formally deposed her from the Neapolitan throne and invested Charles of Durazzo as the new King of Naples, instructing him to invade and conquer the kingdom. What happened next for Joanna was a brutal and swift end to her long and tumultuous reign. The excommunication gave Charles of Durazzo the moral and spiritual authority he needed to rally support against Joanna. He invaded Naples with the backing of Pope Urban VI and Hungarian forces. Joanna, despite her resilience and long experience in defending her throne, found herself isolated. Many of her own nobles, swayed by the excommunication and the promise of a new legitimate ruler, abandoned. Joanna fought bravely, but she was eventually cornered in Castelnuovo, her fortress in Naples. In 1381, Charles of Durazzo captured her. She was imprisoned, and her adopted heir, Louis I of Anjou, who had been her designated successor after her switch to Clement VII, was still gathering his forces in France. Joanna I died in 1382. The circumstances of her death are debated, but it is widely believed that she was suffocated with a silk cord in her prison. On the orders of Charles of Durazzo, her death mirrored that of her first husband, Andrew. Her excommunication was not merely a spiritual condemnation. It was the direct catalyst for her overthrow and murder. Her story is a chilling example of how the Church's most powerful weapon, when wielded by a determined pope against a vulnerable ruler, could lead to a queen's tragic and violent demise. Number 6. Agnes of Morenia, Queen of France. Agnes of Morenia, born around 1175, was a high-ranking noblewoman from the house of Andechs, destined to become Queen of France, but her brief reign was consumed by a monumental church-state conflict that led to her own excommunication. Her story is inextricably linked to the powerful and often scandalous King Philip II Augustus of France. Philip II Augustus was one of the most successful and ambitious kings of France, significantly expanding the royal domain and centralizing power. However, his personal life was a mess, and it brought him into direct conflict with the might of the papacy. Philip had been married to Ingeborg of Denmark in 1193. A politically advantageous match, but from the moment he met her, Philip developed an intense dislike for Ingeborg, possibly due to her appearance, her foreignness, or some other unknown reason. Within days of their wedding, he attempted to divorce her. Philip's attempts to annul his marriage to Ingeborg were audacious and often based on flimsy grounds such as a distant family relationship that would render the marriage incestuous. Despite several councils and appeals, the Church, under the stern and unyielding leadership of Pope Innocent III, consistently refused to grant the annulment. Innocent III was one of the most powerful popes in history, a firm believer in papal supremacy over secular rulers. He would not tolerate a king flouting canon law, especially on a matter as fundamental as marriage. Despite the Pope's clear refusal, Philip II Augustus defiantly decided to take another wife. In 1196, just 3 years after marrying Ingeborg, and while still legally married to her in the eyes of the Church, Philip married Agnes of Morenia. Agnes was a beautiful and charming woman, and Philip was deeply smitten. This marriage was a direct slap in the face to Pope Innocent III and a blatant violation of church law. Philip and Agnes lived openly as husband and wife, and she quickly became pregnant, bearing Philip a son and then a daughter. Pope Innocent III could not let this challenge stand. To him, Philip's bigamous marriage was not just a personal transgression, but an attack on the moral order and the authority of the Church itself. The Pope warned Philip repeatedly, demanding that he put Agnes aside and take Ingeborg back. Philip refused, stubbornly clinging to Agnes. In response, in December 1199, Pope Innocent III issued a devastating decree. He placed the entire Kingdom of France under an interdict. An interdict was an extreme form of spiritual punishment. It did not directly excommunicate individuals, though some might be implicated, but it effectively shut down religious life across the kingdom. Churches were closed, bells were silenced, no baptisms could be performed, no marriages celebrated, no mass said, and no Christian burials allowed. It was a spiritual siege designed to turn the people against their king and force him to comply. For a deeply religious medieval populace, this was a terrifying ordeal, a direct threat to their salvation. While the interdict was primarily directed at the kingdom, Agnes of Morenia, as Philip's unlawful wife, was explicitly mentioned in the papal pronouncements. She was considered to be living in open sin, an accomplice in the king's defiance, and the direct cause of the kingdom's spiritual suffering. She was effectively excommunicated by virtue of her bigamous marriage and her continued cohabitation with Philip. She was forbidden sacraments and communal worship. What happened next for Agnes was a tragic and relatively quick end. The interdict caused immense suffering and discontent throughout France. The French clergy, many of whom supported the Pope, ceased performing religious rites. The people, fearing for their souls, began to pressure the king. Even some of Philip's closest advisors urged him to reconcile with the church. Philip II Augustus, despite his stubbornness, began to feel the pressure. He knew his kingdom could not long endure under such a spiritual burden. In 1200, under intense duress, Philip agreed to send Agnes away. She was moved to the castle of Poissy, effectively imprisoned. But Agnes, deeply devoted to Philip and perhaps weakened by her situation, did not live much longer. She died in July 1201, heartbroken, and possibly from the stress and illness of her predicament. Agnes's death provided Philip with a temporary reprieve, allowing the interdict to be partially lifted. He continued to fight the Pope over Ingeborg for many more years, but Agnes's role in the conflict was over. Her story is a poignant example of how a queen caught in a powerful king's scandalous choices and a pope's unyielding will could find herself personally condemned and ultimately destroyed by the wrath of the Church. She was a queen whose life brought an entire kingdom to its knees and cost her her own life. Number 7. Bertha de Manford, Queen of France. Bertha de Manford, born around 1070, was a woman of captivating beauty and immense ambition. She stepped into the spotlight of French royalty in a way that shocked the entire Christian world and led to her excommunication and a prolonged clash between the King of France and the Pope. Her story is similar to Agnes of Morenia, but it happened earlier and set a precedent for royal defiance against papal marital laws. Bertrade was first married to Fulk IV, Count of Anjou, a powerful and notoriously difficult nobleman. But her true destiny, or so she believed, lay with the King of France, Philip I. Philip I was a weak-willed king, often more interested in pleasure than governance, and he had a long-standing, troubled relationship with his first wife, Bertha of Holland. Despite having a son, Louis, the future Louis VI, with Bertha, Philip decided he wanted her gone. In 1092, Philip I audaciously repudiated Bertha of Holland, claiming she was too fat and he was tired of her. This was a scandalous move, as repudiation of a queen without proper church annulment was a grave offense against canon law and royal legitimacy. Without waiting for, or indeed receiving, any church approval, Philip I then married Bertha de Manford. The problem was, Bertrade was also still married to Fulk IV of Anjou. So Philip was entering a bigamous marriage, and Bertrade was committing bigamy and adultery. This was an outright defiance of sacred marriage vows and the authority of the Church. The Church's reaction was swift and severe. Pope Urban II, a strong and reforming pontiff, could not tolerate such a blatant disregard for Christian morality and canon law from one of Europe's leading monarchs. Pope had just launched the First Crusade, rallying Christian Europe against the infidels, and he needed moral authority. A scandalous king in his own backyard undermined everything. Synods were called first at Autun in 1094, and then at Clermont in 1095. At Clermont, Urban II formally declared King Philip I of France excommunicated. This was a devastating blow. Excommunication cut the king off from the sacraments, from Christian society, and theoretically condemned his soul. But it wasn't just Philip. Bertha de Manford, as the other woman and the reason for the king's transgression, was also explicitly named in the papal bulls and condemned. She was considered to be living in open sin, and as such was excommunicated along with the king. The Pope ordered all bishops and archbishops to implement the excommunication and to place any lands where Philip and Bertrade resided under an interdict. What happened next for Bertrade and Philip was a prolonged and agonizing spiritual standoff. Philip, despite the excommunication, initially refused to abandon Bertrade. He was deeply attached to her. The interdict meant that throughout France, wherever the king and his unlawful queen traveled, churches would be closed. No masses could be said, no baptisms, no marriages, and no Christian burials. This caused immense distress among the deeply religious population. Bishops and abbots who tried to enforce the papal decree were often persecuted by the king's agents. Bertrade, however, was not content with her precarious position. She had a keen interest in politics and exerted considerable influence over the king. She bore Philip 2 sons and a daughter, further complicating the succession and strengthening her hold on him. Despite the spiritual condemnation, she lived openly as queen, attended royal functions, and even engaged in political intrigue against Philip's legitimate son, Louis, trying to secure the succession for her own children. The excommunication hung over France like a dark cloud for over a decade. Philip I and Bertrade would sometimes make token gestures of repentance, promising to separate, which would lead to the excommunication being temporarily lifted. But as soon as the pressure eased, they would invariably resume their scandalous cohabitation, leading to the ban being reinstated. This on, again, off again, excommunication and interdict continued for years, a testament to the Pope's determination and the king's stubbornness. Bertrade, despite her ambition, eventually grew tired of the constant spiritual siege. Perhaps fearing for her soul, or simply weary of the social ostracization, she eventually seems to have genuinely separated from Philip. Philip I finally made a lasting reconciliation with the Church in 1104, making a formal apology and taking an oath to avoid Bertrade. This time the excommunication was finally and permanently lifted. Bertha de Manford lived on for a few more years, maintaining her powerful political connections, but no longer openly living with Philip as his queen. She died in 1117. Her story is a dramatic example of a queen who, driven by ambition and love, openly defied the Church's most sacred laws, plunging an entire kingdom into spiritual distress and earning herself the ultimate condemnation, only to eventually concede to papal power, leaving a complex legacy of defiance. Number 8. Oraka of Leon and Castile, Queen of Leon and Castile. Oraka of Leon and Castile, born in 1081, was the first reigning queen in European history. Her life was a tumultuous saga of power struggles, controversial marriages, and repeated clashes with the Church, leading to multiple excommunications. She inherited the United Kingdoms of Leon and Castile in 1109 upon the death of her father, Alfonso VI. She was already a widow with a young son, Alfonso Raimundez, the future Alfonso VII. Her father, on his deathbed, had arranged a marriage for Oraka that he hoped would secure the future of his realms. She was to marry Alfonso I, the battler king of Aragon and Navarre. Both Oraka and Alfonso were strong-willed rulers, unlikely to share power easily. More critically, they were second cousins, and under canon law, such a close familial relationship constituted incest, requiring a special papal dispensation to be valid. Despite this, the marriage proceeded quickly, driven by political expediency. From the moment the marriage took place, it was a disaster. Oraka and Alfonso I quickly fell into open conflict, unable to agree on who would rule, where, or how. Their relationship was characterized by bitter rivalry, mutual accusations, and even physical violence. They fought over territories, over their respective noble factions, and over the fate of Oraka's young son, Alfonso Raymondez, who was seen as a rival claimant by Alfonso I. This chaotic royal marriage and the ongoing warfare between the two monarchs who were supposed to be united became a major source of concern for the Church. Pope Paschal II, a reforming pontiff, was dismayed by the scandalous nature of the marriage and the widespread conflict it caused. The lack of a papal dispensation for their consanguinity meant the marriage was deemed illegitimate in the eyes of the Church. Pope and his legates repeatedly urged Oraka and Alfonso to separate. When Oraka and Alfonso I refused to separate and continued their chaotic cohabitation and warfare, Pope Paschal II, along with his legates, took decisive action. In 1114, a council held in Palencia, Spain, presided over by a papal legate, officially declared the marriage between Oraka and Alfonso null and void due to consanguinity. More significantly, the council declared that both Oraka and Alfonso I were excommunicated for their continued cohabitation despite the Church's ruling. This was a severe and direct condemnation, stripping them of their spiritual rights. What happened next for Oraka was a continuation of chaos, as the excommunication did not immediately solve her problems or end the conflict. Oraka and Alfonso I, despite the papal decree, continued to live together in mediated struggles. The excommunication meant that in the eyes of the Church they were living in sin, cut off from sacraments, and their souls were condemned. It also provided a powerful tool for her rebellious nobles, who could use the Church's condemnation to justify their defiance against her. Oraka, however, was incredibly resilient. She continued to fight for her throne against her husband, her rebellious nobles, and even against those who championed her son, Alfonso Raymondez, as the rightful ruler. She used her intelligence, her charisma, and sometimes her military prowess to survive. Despite the ongoing spiritual band, she managed to maintain control over much of her kingdom, often playing factions against each other. The excommunication was a constant threat, and Oraka frequently sought reconciliation with the Church. She would sometimes agree to separate from Alfonso I or make gestures of repentance, leading to the ban being temporarily lifted. But her relationship with Alfonso was tumultuous, and the political necessities often brought them back into a precarious alliance, leading to the excommunication being reimposed. This cycle of defiance and temporary reconciliation marked much of her reign. Oraka faced excommunication multiple times throughout her reign, not just for her marriage, but also for her defiance of specific papal directives regarding the governance of the Church within her realms. Each excommunication was a spiritual burden and a political weapon for her enemies, but Oraka, with her remarkable tenacity, always managed to navigate these challenges. Eventually, Oraka and Alfonso I permanently separated in 1114, but the conflicts between them continued until Alfonso I died in 1134. Oraka herself died in 1126, exhausted by over a decade of continuous struggle. Despite the repeated excommunications and the constant turmoil, she successfully maintained her rule as the first queen regnant and secured the succession for her son Alfonso VII. Her story is a testament to the sheer will and political skill of a medieval queen who, despite facing the Church's ultimate condemnation multiple times, managed to hold on to her crown and carve out her own legacy in an incredibly challenging era.